Okay, Brian. So we got a big jam-packed episode to talk about all the top guys that everybody needs to know exactly what they're getting themselves into. It is training camp. So most of these guys that we talk about are going to be expected to be ready for week one. Some might be questionable. We'll get into that. But the big thing is figuring out, okay, how healthy are you? Are you going to be able to hit the ground running? So let's just jump it right into the top, man. Let's talk about these quarterbacks. Anthony Richardson, shoulder, only played 4 games. Well, really 3.5 last season. It was a nightmare because he gave us a taste of what he could be for fantasy purposes. And then we had to sit back and go, oh no, the Gardner Minshew of the world. All right. So when we get into Anthony Richardson, what is your outlook for his health this season?
This is a tough one, man. And not so much because of the injury itself, but more because of the uncertainty surrounding the success of the surgery. And the reason I say that is because he had a grade 3 AC joint separation, which unfortunately requires surgery. And the surgery that they do for this has been around a long time. There's several different variations of it. And unfortunately, when it comes to surgery and success rates, not one of the better ones that we've seen in the orthopedic world. It has a high failure rate. And when you take a guy who plays in the NFL, who is mobile, who's willing to kind of lower his shoulder and take a hit, there is a high likelihood that this could rear its ugly head again this season. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that he will be ready to go and not have any major issues throughout the year. But again, I use that term cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic. Well, I guess it's better than being negatively optimistic. I don't know. Chase, when you hear that and you hear that it is a true injury that could be a re-injury risk. Right now, Anthony Richardson is ADP. He's going QB6. I have him ranked at 6'2". Where do you have him at right now?
I have him at 8, but yeah, ADP is at 6. ECR is around 5. So, I mean, I'm a little low on him to begin with. But hearing this kind of news, like you said, a guy that's his play style. He's going to lower his shoulder. He's going to be much more of a Cam Newton type, or you want him to be more of a Cam Newton type, where he's running and gaining those yards and gaining you fantasy points with his feet. I'm not necessarily sure what Shane Steichen and Jim Bob Cooter would rather have him doing, but listen, at the end of the day, his upside is so great that he's still worth taking a shot on. Like I said, I've got him at 8. I'm only 2 behind him on ADP, and I think I've baked a little bit of the uncertainty around his shoulder into that for me. I've said before, I'm not in the business of predicting injuries, but this is one that we've already had, and we're wondering how he's going to come back from it. It makes me take pause, but he got such a meteoric upstart that, I mean, you almost have to take a shot on it if he falls to you at the right spot.
Well, I mean, you got to take any player that falls in the right spot. I'm not going to come off of him at number 6 personally, just because of this news. We know Anthony Richardson going into the season is a risk, but he's also probably the one guy that I look at who's going outside the top 5 right now, who does have QB1 overall upside because of what he could do with his legs. Now, having said that, if you take Anthony Richardson, let's say in that 5-6 round, you might want to make sure you take a backup to go along with him. And if you don't want to carry 2 quarterbacks in a 1 quarterback redraft league, then maybe Anthony Richardson's not the guy for you. But I would strongly suggest you're getting one of those back-end QB1s. And again, quarterbacks, because of the list, have been pushed down a little bit this season. All right, so that's what we're looking at for Anthony Richardson. So cautiously optimistic, says the doc. What about your favorite player, Brian? Aaron Rodgers. You love talking about this guy.
Well, no surprise. Surprise with Aaron Rodgers. He didn't make his epic comeback in epic record time. No surprises there for us healthcare providers who do this every day. The second coming of Aaron Rodgers' Achilles should be much smoother and hopefully better than it went the first time around in New York here. I think it was a little naive and foolish to think that he could come back so quickly the first time around, but now he's had more than ample time to recover and make a full recovery. And at his age, with his mobility and stuff, I think we should expect to see the Aaron Rodgers of old, assuming he hasn't lost his touch with his arm, because that's really the moneymaker here, not his Achilles. So I don't think we'll see him take long to shake off any rust. I look for him to be just fine in the pocket like he was before this injury. and should get back into the swing of things pretty quick.
Do you think it makes any difference that it was his left leg? It's not his right leg. His
certainly does
back
because
plant leg.
Certainly does. It certainly does because it's not going to affect his ability to generate power and push off that back leg as he, tries to throw with velocity or down the field. So yeah, it certainly does make a difference that it was the left side, given he's a right-handed quarterback. Absolutely.
So yeah, we know Aaron Rodgers is going to be back week 1. I think the NFL is counting on that for him to at least get through the first half of the season. That's why there's so many primetime Jet games we have coming up on the schedule here. From a fantasy football perspective, look, if you're in a typical redraft league, and we do content for the guys who are for the average Joe, all right? We're not doing it for the high stakes guys. We're not necessarily doing it for the Superflex guys. We're doing it for the people who are typically in 10 to 12 man leagues, one quarterback redraft leagues, at least this time of the year anyway. So you're probably not going to draft Aaron Rodgers. His ADP is QB 20. I have him ranked at 21. Even when he was healthy, it's been a couple years removed now since we've seen Aaron Rodgers be a fantasy asset to begin with because he had a really bad last year in Green Bay. So I don't think we're looking at this from a Rodgers perspective. I'm looking at this like, all right, if Rodgers is good to go, Chase, how good can Garrett Wilson be here? Because, I got him like wide receiver 7, and I'm thinking last year I was on him, man. I had him in my top 5. I was ready to roll, and, just it all came crashing down. Now I have him at 7. I'm not as bullish, but I think he could be elite. I think he's ready to make that jump. What do you think?
I really like Garrett Wilson. I've got him at 6 right now preliminarily. And so I'm right there with you. I think that the sky's the limit for him. Talent wise, I think that, I think Mike Williams, if Mike Williams is healthy, I think that's only going to help Garrett Wilson because you won't be able to completely blanket him with coverage. But yeah, I think that Wilson, this will be by far the best quarterback play that he's seen in his short time in the NFL. You can't get much worse than what he's gotten from Zach Wilson and company over the last couple of years. So I'm really excited for Garrett Wilson. I'm excited for to see that whole team kind of operate and function. But yeah, like you said, Rodgers, he maybe personally isn't going to give you a ton, but I think that he is going to be a rising tide for every other boat on that New York Jets offense.
Oh, and you gotta be confident about your Achilles when you show up to camp in flip flops and jeans, right? Right. You have to be confident. Otherwise it's not happening. Kirk Cousins. So you asked the question, also coming off an Achilles injury, but talking about plant foot. Now his plant foot is the one that was affected in this. So what's your breakdown here? Where Kirk Cousins trying to get his way back from an Achilles injury later in the season?
Well, a couple of months ago, I think it might have been around March or April, and he was about 4 months out, I think, from his surgery. He looked pretty good. He was already on an indoor tennis court doing 5-step drops and throwing off his back foot and stuff. So, while that's encouraging, I do implore everyone to pump the brakes a little bit. He is 36. I think he's still got a lot in the tank, but I'm not so sure he's going to be ready at 100% come the start of training camp. However, I think he's going to have ample time to get there. I do think, however, if he ends up being the starting QB, I think they're going to keep him on a short leash. I wouldn't be surprised if they use that Achilles as an excuse to have him on a short leash and maybe yank him early if there's not a lot of success there, knowing that they've got Michael Penix Jr. on the bench.
I don't know how short of a leash you can be on when he's got the guaranteed contract that they just gave him. They can't get out of it within 2 years. Really, financially speaking, it's going to be at least 3, unless he really just craps tons and Michael Penix takes over.
I think they took a gamble, and this big contract was just a short-term solution for their quarterback woes they've had the last few years. But knowing what they got on the bench there and that rookie they drafted, and Atlanta being Atlanta. And not really being much success the last few years, I don't see them waiting too long to give him the old.
They definitely painted themselves into a corner with that draft pick and with the whole situation there. But yeah, it's a touchy situation when you're talking about a guy that may or may not be ready for the beginning of the year, or may not be fully ready to go. And again, it's somebody that we're counting on to kind of raise that whole level of that offense. They've had such terrible quarterback play since Matt Ryan left. There's been, some hype around again, but maybe justified this time around Kyle Pitts, around Drake London, around that entire offense. And I actually have Cousins ranked 2 behind Rodgers. I've got him at 19. I've got Rodgers at 17. I'm a little more excited about him than you are there, Dan, but Cousins has me a little bit more worried than Aaron Rodgers does.
Well, and clearly the doctor feels a little more cautious, at least for the start of the season, too. Now, we're getting into training camp. We're going to see how these guys are going to be able to react. We'll get a lot more information. This is getting you ready for that is the whole point of this episode. Cousins is kind of in the same boat with Rodgers. I have Cousins at 18. I do have him ahead of Rodgers just because I think the offense of Atlanta is better if he wants it being good to go for week 1. That's most of it comes down to for me. And then the other thing is that Cousins has been much better fantasy-wise more recently than Aaron Rodgers has been. I mean, last year he was actually on his way to having his best fantasy season yet when he was QB7. He's been a top 12 quarterback every single season since 2020, and he's got a ton of offensive weapons with what I think, even though we haven't seen him call plays yet, I have good I can't explain it other than I have a gut feeling. I have good confidence in Zach Robinson and what he's going to do down there in Atlanta. So I think Cousins, from that standpoint of, again, another player you're probably not drafting. You want him to amplify Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and we laid it out here. With Michael Penix there backing him up, either way, you're going to have better quarterback play than you had last season. Either way, you're going to have better play calling than you had last season. So that's a given as far as those players being elevated from what you've gotten in previous seasons. The question is, if Cousins plays, he's probably the best bet to maximize their ceiling production. But with Cousins, too, I'm not going to ignore him here because if he's getting drafted at QB 18, he's somebody who's going to probably be on the waiver wire list. This is somebody who's continually be a top 12 quarterback. If your plan is to go into this draft and completely wait at quarterback, which I have urged some people to do, I am exercising that in quite a number of drafts. He is the perfect candidate to be that streaming quarterback, the guy you just take super late because you put it on the position and load it up everywhere else. He can be that type of guy. There's a number of guys in that tier that I'm looking at from that standpoint. So just to kind of throw that out there.
And don't get me wrong, Dan. Kirk Cousins is a consummate professional. He's going to do everything that training staff asks of him. He's going to do everything that those doctors tell him to do. He is going to attack his rehab in the same way he attacks game preparation and planning. If there is a guy that you want coming off this injury, he's the guy. But physiologically, he's just going to need probably a little bit more time to be a year here.
Okay. What about Joe Burrow? It looks like we're getting some good news on him. Talk about a guy who is fantasy relevant, is being drafted into the top 10. So what do you got on him?
Yeah, the only thing that worries me about Burrow is the short time in this league. He's racked up quite a few injuries, which have cost him quite a bit of time on the injured list, dating back to his ACL injury, meniscus injury, his calf strain last year, then the wrist. I mean, it's like things just keep adding up and keep taking him out of the lineup, unfortunately. He's also kind of a thin, wiry frame guy, and it doesn't take much to put him down. I'm optimistic that coming off this wrist injury, it shouldn't be a major hamper to his season. I think he'll be as good as he's going to be. Considering last season at preseason, he dealt with this calf thing that lingered into the year. So I think we might see him healthier than he has been in the last 2 seasons. So for that reason, I'm optimistic.
Chase, when Burrow has played an entire year, which was 2021, 2022, we're not just talking about a QB1. We're talking about an elite quarterback. 2022 finished in the top 5. He seems like a guy who, with his talent and the roster around him, he feels like a guy who could push for 40 touchdowns in a season at some point in his career if he could put it all together, which there's not a ton of quarterbacks who have that kind of potential. So when we're looking at Burrow right now, he's being drafted as QB7. I'm a little lower. I have him at QB8. Where do you have him at right now?
I've got him at 6. I'm actually a little higher. And I think, we talked before about where we had Richardson. I think I've pretty much got him and Richardson flip-flop from where I think you were seeing them. But yeah, I mean, I've got Jamar Chase at wide receiver 2 because I'm big on what I think Burrow can do this year. And hey, we got the all systems go, full speed ahead call earlier this week from him. About him from his coaching staff. So I'm psyched up about what we can see out of Joe Burrow, because like you said, in terms of those guys that we don't think of as running quarterbacks, the guys that we think of as just as purely on their passing merit, he's right up there towards the top in terms of the fantasy return that he can give you minus that rushing upside. So I'm all in on Joe Burrow if I can get him.
And now you get a discount because last year we couldn't get a discount on him. You were drafting Joe Burrow in the 5th, 6th round. Now we're looking more like the 7th, 8th round, a much more reasonable place to take a guy who has had the injury history that he's had. Deshaun Watson. Okay, I get it. Nobody really wants to touch Deshaun Watson for a multitude of different reasons. But I'm a little intrigued. I'll get into why later. But first, we have to figure out how healthy is this guy? Because he's been banged up ever since he's been trying to become a Cleveland Brown. So, Brian, what do you got on that shoulder, man?
Well, nobody wants to touch him less than a massage therapist. Let's get that out there right away. He had a season-ending shoulder injury, what was termed as a glenoid fracture, which essentially means that rather than dislocating his shoulder, he probably subluxed it or partially dislocated it, which caused the fracture. And it is his throwing shoulder as well. So that's a little concerning. That's not an easy surgery and treatment and rehab to bounce back from. But I think it was pretty early in the season, if I'm not mistaken, that this did occur. So he has had quite a bit of time. I'm sorry.
Week six.
Week 6. I mean, it's fairly early compared to later in the year. So he should have had ample time to recover from this. A football quarterback throwing the ball, not quite like a baseball pitcher mechanically, not quite like a tennis player doing an overhand serve. A little bit different stresses placed on the shoulder. And for that reason, this is something guys can bounce back from. You have to wonder, though, with all the legal issues he had over the years, with all the time he missed from that, being a little bit older now, is this something that's going to kind of set him back and maybe not allow him to achieve that high level of play that he could have if he was younger and healthier? We'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tricky part with that throwing shoulder injury. And we have, corner reports, he is full systems go right now. Brian, it sounds like you have some concerns, at least about the re-aggravation aspect of it. Chase, I'm looking at Deshaun Watson and this is it, man. As far as are we going to get anything out of him or not? They brought in Ken Dorsey. Kevin Stefanski's talking about turning the play calling over. They acquired Jerry Jeudy. Everything has been all about we're putting together the spread offense that made Deshaun Watson great when he was in Houston. That's what this whole offseason's been about. And we're going to talk about Nick Chubb in a little bit, depending upon where he's at injury-wise. It may just make it even more so that they want to lean into that. Does that intrigue you at all with Deshaun Watson?
It does, but only in the right circumstance. Like you've said, I mean, he's going QB 21 overall right now on his ADP. That's right where I have him ranked, actually. So similar to Rodgers, similar to Cousins, I've got him at a mid to low quarterback 2. So if it's a single quarterback league, especially a 10 team league, I'm not touching him. I'm not even thinking about touching him, regardless of whether I got Richardson to start or whatever else. But if I'm in a 2 quarterback setting, I might be willing to take the risk on him because you might be able to wait a little bit longer on him and, stack yourself up at other positions. But that if Deshaun Watson plays to his capability, he can return a lot of fantasy points for you. And like you said, they have been trying all offseason. They've worked on trying to put the resources around him and build this offense up in his time there so that it can be the offense that he did thrive in. Brian, is this the kind of thing that you would expect to affect his throwing strength, his throwing motion at all? Would it be more so when he takes off to run that you'd be worried about it, or?
So the good thing here for Deshaun Watson is that this is not an injury that was related to any chronic instability of his shoulder. This was more of a traumatic type injury. So assuming everything went well with surgery, his shoulder has healed up nicely. Once he can work out some of that stiffness in the beginning, we shouldn't really see any major deficits that linger down the road here. So I think once he gets back into the swing of things and he starts throwing with normal velocity and power, we shouldn't really see too much of a drop off.
Awesome. I like the gamble on him as a QB too. If you're in that kind of a format, then it's wheels up on him because, like I said, you can get him at a little bit more of a discount compared to some guys. And based on other guys in that range, he does have a high upside if he can recapture that glory.
Well, and I'm going to throw this out there. I'm in a Dynasty league. It's a Superflex league, and I'm sending out trade offers to see if I can go ahead and buy low on the guy, because this is the time. If he does pop with all these things in place, this is the last chance you're going to have to be able to kind of buy low on the guy where people are not sure if he is even worth anything. So maybe take a stab at that, especially sitting at Superflex Dynasty league. That's kind of what I'm looking at myself.